The skies above the Arctic Circle stretched in an endless expanse of white and gray. February 1943. A formation of 6 heavy bombers clawed through the freezing air at 16,000 feet, their engines straining against temperatures that plunged to 60 degrees below zero. The aircraft Consolidated Liberators assigned to Coastal Command were returning from a patrol mission over the Barents Sea. They had been searching for German U-boats threatening the Arctic convoys, those vital supply lines that kept the Soviet Union in the fight against the Third Reich. But now, the hunters had become the hunted, not by enemy fighters, but by something far more insidious. Their compasses had gone mad. Flight Lieutenant Edward Jameson pressed his face against the frost-rimmed window of his navigation station in the lead aircraft, codenamed Polaris 1. He watched the magnetic compass needle swing wildly, dancing between headings that differed by 40 degrees in the span of a single second. At this latitude, mere hundreds of miles from the magnetic North Pole, the horizontal component of Earth's magnetic field grew so weak that the compass became essentially useless. The needle that had guided mariners and aviators for centuries was now a spinning piece of metal, offering nothing but confusion. Behind Jameson, the wireless operator was frantically trying to raise their base in Iceland. Static crackled through his headphones, a wall of electromagnetic noise that swallowed every transmission. The auroral activity that painted green and purple curtains across the Arctic sky was beautiful to behold, but it was also disrupting radio communications. They were blind, deaf, and lost. If you are finding value in this story, now would be a good moment to subscribe to the channel and click that bell for notifications. This is the kind of deeply researched historical content we specialize in. Stories of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances with nothing but their wits and training. Jameson was 32 years old, a former mathematics teacher from Surrey who had joined the Royal Air Force at the outbreak of war. He had always possessed an unusual gift for spatial reasoning, ability to hold complex geometric relationships in his mind and manipulate them without pencil and paper. In peacetime, this talent had made him an excellent teacher. In war, it made him one of Coastal Command's most skilled navigators. But even Jameson felt the cold fingers of fear creeping up his spine as he surveyed his instruments. They had been airborne for 9 hours. Their fuel reserves were critically low. And somewhere out there, in that featureless expanse of cloud and ice, lay the difference between a safe landing and a frozen grave in the Arctic Ocean. The problem with Arctic navigation was not new. Explorers had struggled with it for centuries. The magnetic pole, that point toward which compass needles are drawn, was not located at the geographic North Pole. Instead, it sat in the Canadian Arctic, and its position shifted constantly, moving miles in a single year. The closer an aircraft flew to this magnetic pole, the more unreliable its compass became. The needle would try to dip downward, following the increasingly vertical magnetic field lines, and the horizontal direction it indicated became increasingly erratic. This phenomenon, known as magnetic inclination or dip, had confounded polar navigators since the earliest days of Arctic exploration. Jameson knew all of this. He had studied the theoretical challenges of polar navigation during his training, but theoretical knowledge felt cold comfort now, with 6 aircraft and 42 men depending on his calculations. He pulled out his chart, covered with penciled lines and notations, and began to think through the problem systematically. The magnetic compass was useless. Their radio navigation aids were being jammed by natural interference. What did he have left? The answer came to him as he stared at his astral compass, a specialized instrument designed for high-latitude flying. Unlike the magnetic compass, which sought magnetic north, the astral compass was oriented by celestial bodies. In theory, if one could see the sun, moon, or stars, one could determine direction. But the problem was that at this latitude and time of year, the sun barely rose above the horizon, and the thick overcast that had dogged them for hours made celestial observation impossible. But Jameson was thinking beyond the immediate problem. He recalled something he had read in a technical bulletin several months earlier, an experimental technique being developed by navigators flying in the Canadian Arctic. It was called grid navigation, and its principle was elegantly simple. Instead of using magnetic north or even true north as the reference direction, grid navigation imposed an arbitrary grid system over the polar regions. All directions were measured relative to this grid, which did not change with magnetic variations or the curvature of longitude lines near the poles. The concept had been theoretical, untested in operational conditions. The American 46th Reconnaissance Squadron would not begin their systematic development and testing of grid navigation until 1946, 3 years in the future. But Jameson, with his mathematical background and his desperate situation, saw a way to improvise a crude version of the technique right there, in the cockpit of his Liberator. He pulled out his directional gyroscope reading. Unlike the magnetic compass, the gyroscope did not rely on the Earth's magnetic field. It was a spinning mass that maintained its orientation in space through angular momentum. The problem was that gyroscopes drifted over time, their indicated direction slowly wandering away from reality due to the rotation of the Earth and mechanical imperfections. Without regular correction from a magnetic compass or celestial observation, a gyroscope could be off by several degrees per hour. But Jameson realized something crucial. He knew exactly when they had last had an accurate heading. Approximately 4 hours earlier, before the aurora had intensified and the magnetic anomalies had worsened, he had taken a precise sunshot through a momentary break in the clouds. He had noted the time and their gyroscope heading at that exact moment. If he could calculate how much the gyroscope had drifted since then, he could correct it and establish an accurate heading. The drift rate of a directional gyroscope depends on several factors, including the latitude at which the aircraft is flying. At the equator, the apparent drift caused by the Earth's rotation is 0. At the poles, it reaches its maximum value of approximately 15 degrees per hour. At the intermediate latitudes where they were flying, somewhere around 70 degrees north, the drift would be approximately 14 degrees per hour. Jameson's mind raced through the calculations. 4 hours at 14 degrees per hour meant a total drift of approximately 56 degrees. But the drift direction also depended on which hemisphere they were in and which direction they had been flying. The Earth rotates from west to east, which causes the apparent drift of a gyroscope to vary depending on the aircraft's position and motion. He pulled out his Dalton computer, a circular slide rule device that every navigator carried, and began working through the complex spherical trigonometry that polar navigation demanded. His fingers were numb despite the heated gloves, and his breath crystallized in the frigid air of the navigation station. But his mind was fully engaged, running through the mathematics with the same precision he had once used to demonstrate calculus problems to his students. After 15 minutes of intense concentration, Jameson had his answer. The gyroscope had drifted approximately 52 degrees to the right of its true heading. He applied this correction mentally, establishing what he believed to be their true course. But this was only half the solution. Knowing which way they were pointed meant nothing if he did not know where they were. Here Jameson relied on dead reckoning, the ancient art of navigation that depended on knowing one's starting position, one's heading, one's speed, and the elapsed time. From these factors, a navigator could calculate their current position. The problem was that dead reckoning accumulated errors over time. A slight miscalculation of airspeed, an undetected wind shift, a small error in heading, all of these compounded over the hours until the calculated position could be miles from reality. Jameson knew his dead reckoning position was uncertain. 9 hours of flight, with multiple course changes and varying winds, meant an error radius of perhaps 100 miles. In the vast Arctic, this was the difference between reaching Iceland and crashing into the Greenland ice cap, or, worse, running out of fuel over the frigid waters of the Denmark Strait. But Jameson had one more trick up his sleeve. During the mission, he had been carefully tracking their radar returns. The Liberator was equipped with ASV Mark II radar, designed for detecting submarines on the surface of the sea. But the radar could also detect land, and its returns could be used for navigation. As they had flown northward earlier in the day, he had noted the radar signatures of several distinctive coastal features, a particular fjord, a prominent headland, a cluster of islands. He had noted the times and the radar bearings to each of these features. Now, on the return journey, he could use this information in reverse. If they passed close enough to any of these features, the radar would detect them, and he could use the bearings to establish a fix. The challenge was that they needed to be within radar range, approximately 50 miles, depending on conditions, and they needed to recognize the features when they appeared. Jameson called forward to the pilot, Squadron Leader Thompson, and explained his plan. He proposed altering course slightly to the west, aiming for a point that he believed would bring them within radar range of the Icelandic coast. From there, they could follow the coastline south to their base at Keflavik. Thompson listened carefully, asked a few pointed questions, and then agreed. At this point, Jameson's calculated guess was their best hope. The 6 Liberators banked gently to the west, their formation maintaining the tight coherence that was essential for mutual protection. If enemy aircraft appeared, each bomber's gunners would defend not just their own aircraft, but their neighbors as well. But no enemy came. The only adversary they faced was the Arctic itself. For the next 90 minutes, Jameson watched the radar scope with unwavering attention. The green sweep of the electron beam painted patterns of electronic noise, false returns from the aurora, and the occasional ghost image that meant nothing. His eyes burned from the strain, and his head throbbed from the thin air at altitude, despite the oxygen mask pressed against his face. Then he saw it. A solid return at the edge of the radar range, bearing approximately 240 degrees. It was not a submarine or a ship. The return was too large and too persistent. It was land. Jameson watched the return for several sweeps, confirming its reality, and then cross-referenced it with his chart. The bearing and estimated range matched a prominent headland on the northwest coast of Iceland, a feature known as Hornbjarg. Navigation to pilot, Jameson spoke into the intercom, his voice betraying none of the relief flooding through his body. "I have a radar fix. Recommend new heading of 185 degrees. Estimated time to Keflavik, approximately 70 minutes. Squadron Leader Thompson acknowledged the report and began the turn. Behind them, the other 5 Liberators followed, their crews unaware that they had been perhaps 30 miles from death, their fuel gauges hovering just above empty. The descent into Keflavik was uneventful. The cloud base lifted as they approached the coast, revealing the stark volcanic landscape of Iceland beneath them. The runway appeared like a gray scar on the tundra, and one by one the 6 bombers touched down, their tires smoking on the frozen concrete. Later that evening, in the operations hut at Keflavik, Jameson wrote his navigation log. He described the compass failures, the radio interference, and the impromptu technique he had developed to maintain course. The report made its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching the headquarters of Coastal Command in England. An intelligence officer noted the innovative approach and flagged it for the attention of the navigation training staff. This is an important moment in our story, and if you are still watching, it means you appreciate this kind of deep dive into historical events. Please take a second to hit the like button. Your engagement helps the algorithm share this content with more history enthusiasts like yourself. What Jameson had discovered through necessity, others were simultaneously developing through systematic research. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces were grappling with the same challenges of polar navigation. The war had made the Arctic strategically vital. The shortest bombing routes between North America and the industrial heartland of Germany passed over the Arctic. Lend-Lease aircraft being delivered to the Soviet Union flew through the Arctic. The German U-boats preying on Arctic convoys operated in these northern waters, and there was growing awareness that any future conflict with the Soviet Union would require the ability to project air power across the polar regions. The Americans had begun experimenting with various solutions. The Bumstead Sun Compass, a device that used the position of the sun rather than magnetism to determine direction, offered one approach, but it required clear skies and a visible sun, conditions that were far from guaranteed in the Arctic. Radio navigation systems like LORAN, or long-range navigation, offered another possibility. LORAN used the timing differences between signals from multiple ground stations to determine position with remarkable accuracy, but it required a network of transmitting stations, and in the Arctic, such infrastructure did not exist. The most promising approach was the one Jameson had stumbled upon, the integration of gyroscopic instruments with a grid-based navigation system. The idea was simple in concept, but demanding in execution. A navigator would establish an artificial reference direction, typically the Greenwich meridian, and express all headings relative to this reference. The gyroscope would maintain this reference direction, with periodic corrections calculated mathematically, rather than derived from magnetic instruments. After the war ended, this approach would be systematically developed and perfected. The 46th Reconnaissance Squadron, operating from Ladd Field in Alaska, would become the pioneers of operational grid navigation. In August 1946, they began flying missions over the unexplored Arctic, testing and refining navigation techniques in the harshest conditions on Earth. The challenges they faced were formidable. At extreme northern latitudes, the lines of longitude converge so rapidly that standard navigation techniques become problematic. A heading of due north means something different at each point along a parallel of latitude, because north points in a slightly different direction at each location. Grid navigation solved this by imposing a uniform reference system that did not change with position. The squadron flew mission after mission, each one extending human knowledge of Arctic navigation. Their aircraft, modified Consolidated Liberators designated as the F-13, were equipped with the latest instruments, directional gyroscopes, astral compasses, radar altimeters, and specialized charts designed for high-latitude navigation. The navigators on these flights developed techniques for correcting gyroscopic drift, for maintaining orientation during the long Arctic twilight, and for navigating when all conventional methods failed. On October 16, 1946, one of these aircraft accomplished something that had never been done before. Using the grid navigation system they had developed, the crew flew directly over the geographic North Pole and knew with certainty that they had reached it. Previous polar flights, including the famous expeditions of Byrd and Amundsen, had navigated with less precise methods and could not be certain of their exact position at the pole. The 46th Reconnaissance Squadron's flight proved that grid navigation worked, that human beings could navigate anywhere on Earth with precision, regardless of magnetic anomalies or the convergence of longitude lines. But let us return to Jameson and the events of February 1943, for his story did not end with the safe landing at Keflavik. The report he had written caught the attention of an Air Ministry scientist named Harold Larnder, who was studying the problems of polar navigation. Larnder recognized that Jameson's improvised solution anticipated the direction in which navigation theory was heading. He arranged for Jameson to be temporarily reassigned to the Air Ministry for consultation. For 3 weeks, Jameson worked with Larnder, and a team of mathematicians, physicists, and experienced navigators. They analyzed his techniques, identified the sources of error, and developed improvements. The result was a set of provisional procedures for Arctic navigation that was circulated to coastal command squadrons operating in northern waters. These procedures emphasized three key principles. First, navigators should maintain continuous awareness of their gyroscope's drift rate and apply regular calculated corrections. Second, radar should be used aggressively for navigation with distinctive coastal features identified and cataloged in advance of missions. Third, dead reckoning should be treated as a baseline to be refined by other methods, not as an authoritative source of position. The procedures also introduced a simplified version of grid navigation for emergency use. If compass failure occurred at high latitudes, navigators were instructed to establish an arbitrary reference direction based on their last known heading, maintain this direction using the gyroscope, and navigate toward distinctive radar or visual features that could confirm position. These procedures saved lives. Coastal Command's Arctic operations continued throughout 1943 and 1944, with aircraft flying over some of the most inhospitable territory on Earth. The techniques that Jameson had pioneered became standard practice, refined and improved by the collective experience of hundreds of navigators facing similar challenges. The human cost of getting navigation wrong was starkly illustrated by numerous incidents throughout the war. Aircraft that strayed off course over the Arctic often vanished without a trace. The lucky ones crashed on land, giving their crews a chance of survival. The unlucky ones ran out of fuel over the sea, where water temperatures were so cold that a human being would lose consciousness within minutes and succumb within an hour. One such incident occurred in December 1943, when a B-24 Liberator flying over the Alaskan interior lost engine power and crashed on a mountainside. Of the 6 crew members aboard, only one survived, Second Lieutenant Leon Crane, the aircraft's pilot. Crane parachuted from the burning aircraft into temperatures of 50 degrees below zero. He spent 84 days surviving in the Alaskan wilderness, following frozen rivers until he reached a trapper's cabin. His ordeal became a famous survival story, but it underscored the unforgiving nature of Arctic operations. Navigation errors that might be recoverable in temperate climates became death sentences in the polar regions. The Germans faced similar challenges in their Arctic operations. Their U-boats, operating in the northern seas against the Allied convoys, relied on surface navigation techniques that worked reasonably well. But their aircraft, the reconnaissance planes and bombers that attacked the convoys, struggled with the same navigation problems that plagued the Allies. The Arctic was an equal opportunity adversary, showing no favoritism between nations. British intelligence, reading German communications through the Ultra program, sometimes detected enemy aircraft that had become lost over the Arctic. Luftwaffe pilots would transmit confused position reports, their locations drifting further from reality with each update. On occasion, these lost aircraft would fly until their fuel was exhausted, their final transmissions a blend of confusion and despair. It was a fate that could just as easily have befallen Allied crews, and sometimes did. The technology of Arctic navigation advanced rapidly during and after the war. The gyromagnetic compass, which combined a gyroscope with a magnetic sensor, offered a partial solution to the high-latitude navigation problem. The gyroscope provided stable directional reference, while the magnetic sensor provided periodic corrections at lower latitudes. More sophisticated versions could detect when magnetic readings became unreliable and rely solely on the gyroscope until conditions improved. Inertial navigation systems, developed primarily for missiles and spacecraft in the years after the war, eventually offered a complete solution to the Arctic navigation problem. These systems used accelerometers and gyroscopes to track an aircraft's movements from a known starting point, calculating position without any external reference. By the 1960s, military aircraft routinely carried inertial navigation equipment that made polar flights routine. But in February 1943, such technology lay in the future. Jameson and his fellow navigators had only their training, their instruments, and their wits. What made Jameson exceptional was not the sophistication of his equipment, but his ability to combine different sources of information, to recognize which sources were reliable under which conditions, and to improvise solutions when standard procedures failed. This ability to adapt, to think creatively under pressure, was perhaps the most important navigation tool of all. It could not be installed in an aircraft or calibrated in a workshop. It existed only in the minds of men like Edward Jameson, developed through education, experience, and the urgent necessity of wartime operations. After his consultation with the Air Ministry, Jameson returned to operational flying with his squadron. He continued to navigate Arctic patrols throughout 1943 and into 1944, applying and refining the techniques he had developed. His aircraft never again experienced the complete navigation failure of that February mission, but there were close calls, moments when the compasses swung wildly and the radios fell silent, moments when only careful calculation stood between the crew and disaster. In August 1944, Jameson's Liberator was attacked by a German Junkers 88 fighter over the Norwegian Sea. The fighter came out of the sun, its guns blazing, before the bomber's crew had time to react. The first pass killed the top turret gunner and wounded the radio operator. The aircraft's hydraulic system was damaged, making control difficult. Jameson, at his navigation station, saw the fighter through the Astrodome as it wheeled around for a second attack. He immediately grabbed the drift sight, an optical device normally used for measuring wind direction, and began calling out the fighter's position and movements to the gunners. His clear, calm voice gave them the situational awareness they needed. On the second pass, the Liberator's tail gunner found his mark. A stream of tracer rounds walked across the fighter's engine, cowling, and black smoke began pouring from the German aircraft. The Junkers broke off the attack and dove toward the sea, trailing a long plume of oily smoke. Whether the pilot survived to ditch or went straight in, the Liberator's crew never knew. The damaged bomber limped back to base, its wounded crew members receiving emergency treatment from the aircraft's rudimentary first aid kit. Jameson navigated them home with the same precision he always displayed, calculating a course that minimized the distance while avoiding areas of known German air activity. They landed with fuel gauges reading empty and a hydraulic system that gave out the moment the wheels touched the runway. For his actions during this mission, Jameson was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation praised his navigational excellence and his cool-headed response to the fighter attack. He received the medal in a quiet ceremony at his squadron's base, the wing commander pinning it to his uniform while a small group of fellow officers looked on. We are now entering the final chapters of this story. If you have made it this far, you are clearly passionate about military history. Please consider subscribing to join our community of history enthusiasts. We have many more stories like this one, tales of ordinary individuals who achieved extraordinary things in the crucible of war. Jameson survived the war. He flew his final mission in April 1945, a patrol over the North Sea that encountered nothing more dangerous than a patch of severe turbulence. By then, the German U-boat threat had been decisively defeated, and Coastal Command's focus had shifted to other tasks. Jameson was demobilized in September 1945, returning to his teaching career with a chest full of medals and a head full of memories. He rarely spoke about the war and the years that followed. When students or colleagues asked about his service, he would mention that he had been a navigator in Coastal Command, and then change the subject. The technical details of Arctic navigation, The moments of fear and triumph over the frozen seas remained locked inside him. But he did contribute to the permanent record. In 1947, at the request of the Royal Air Force's Navigation Training Command, he wrote a detailed technical paper on high-latitude navigation techniques. The paper drew on his wartime experience and incorporated the advances made since the war's end. It became required reading for RAF navigators preparing for Arctic operations and influenced training programs for decades afterward. The paper's central insight was the importance of what Jameson called navigation without reference, the ability to maintain positional awareness when all external aids failed. He argued that navigators needed to understand the physical principles underlying their instruments, not just how to read them. Only this deeper understanding would enable them to recognize instrument failures and improvise solutions. He also emphasized the psychological dimension of Arctic navigation. The isolation, the cold, the monotonous landscape, all of these could induce a kind of mental numbness that degraded performance. Navigators needed to actively fight against this numbness, maintaining focus and alertness through deliberate effort. He recommended specific techniques, regular physical movement within the aircraft, mental exercises and calculations, verbal communication with other crew members. Jameson's paper was classified for many years, its distribution limited to military personnel with appropriate clearances. Only in the 1980s, when the Cold War concerns that had kept it classified had faded, was it released to the public. By then, satellite navigation had made many of its specific techniques obsolete. But the underlying principles remained valid, a testament to the timeless nature of sound navigation practice. The technology of navigation continued to advance long after Jameson's retirement. The Global Positioning System, or GPS, developed by the United States military, eventually made it possible to determine position anywhere on Earth to within a few meters. Modern aircraft carry GPS receivers as standard equipment, and pilots and navigators can know their position with an accuracy that Jameson could only have dreamed of. But the old ways have not been entirely forgotten. Military navigators still learn dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and the techniques for operating when electronic aids fail. In an era of electronic warfare, when GPS signals can be jammed or spoofed, the skills that Jameson developed remain relevant. An adversary might be able to disable satellites or interfere with radio signals, but they cannot change the position of the stars or the principles of mathematics that govern spherical trigonometry. And there are places where the old challenges remain. The polar regions still present unique navigation problems despite all the advances in technology. Magnetic compasses remain unreliable near the poles. GPS accuracy degrades slightly at extreme latitudes. And the harsh conditions, the cold, the isolation, the unpredictable weather, continue to demand the same qualities that Jameson displayed: skill, judgment, adaptability, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The story of Edward Jameson's compass calibration trick is, in some ways, a small story. It involves no great battles, no decisive turning points, no figures of historical renown. It is the story of one man, on one mission, solving one problem. But it is precisely these small stories that, taken together, constitute the real history of the war. The great commanders made strategy. The politicians set policy. The scientists developed weapons. But it was men like Jameson, thousands of them, who actually fought the war day by day, mission by mission. They faced challenges that no one could have anticipated and improvised solutions that no training program could have taught. They operated at the edge of human capability, in conditions that tested every limit of endurance and skill. Jameson's contribution to the development of Arctic navigation was significant, but ultimately it was just one contribution among many. The grid navigation system that became standard for polar operations was developed by teams of researchers and operational crews, working together over years. No single individual can claim credit for the result, but there is something valuable in focusing on individual stories nonetheless. They remind us that history is made by human beings, not by abstract forces or technological inevitabilities. Edward Jameson, a mathematics teacher from Surrey, applied his training and intelligence to a problem that threatened his life and the lives of his crew. He succeeded, and his success contributed to the larger enterprise of winning the war. In the end, that is perhaps the most important lesson of his story. Expertise matters. Training matters. The ability to think clearly under pressure matters. These qualities are not innate. They are developed through education and experience. Jameson was able to save his squadron because he understood the principles of navigation deeply enough to improvise when standard procedures failed. That understanding came from years of study and practice, from a professional culture that valued technical excellence, from an institution that invested in the training and development of its personnel. The Royal Air Force and the Allied Air Forces more generally won the air war in part because they developed this kind of expertise and disseminated it throughout their organizations. The Germans had excellent equipment and brave pilots, but they never matched the Allied investment in navigation, in meteorology, in the 1,000 technical skills that made sustained air operations possible. Jameson lived until 1983, dying peacefully in his home at the age of 72. He had returned to teaching after the war, eventually becoming headmaster of a grammar school in Kent. His former students remembered him as a demanding but fair teacher, one who insisted on understanding rather than mere memorization. He never mentioned the war in his classrooms, but occasionally, when a student struggled with a mathematics problem, he would offer encouragement with an odd phrase. "Work through it systematically," he would say. "The answer is there. You just have to find it." It was advice that applied to navigating the curriculum, and it was advice that had once, in the frozen skies above the Arctic, saved 42 lives. The navigation techniques that Jameson helped develop remained classified for decades, but their descendants are now ubiquitous. Every smartphone contains a GPS receiver that can determine position to within a few meters. Every commercial aircraft carries navigation systems of extraordinary sophistication. The problem of knowing where you are, a challenge that once required years of training to master, is now solved automatically by electronics that cost a few dollars to manufacture. This technological triumph is, in its way, a monument to the work of navigators like Jameson. They identified the problems, developed the solutions, and proved that reliable navigation was possible under any conditions. The engineers and scientists who built GPS drew on this foundation of knowledge, applying electronic technology to challenges that had been defined by decades of operational experience. But the human dimension should not be forgotten. For all its power, technology can fail. Batteries die, signals are jammed, software crashes. When that happens, human beings must fall back on their training and judgment, just as Jameson did in that frozen cockpit over the Arctic. The navigators of the Second World War understood this. They carried backup instruments, learned alternative techniques, and maintained skills that they hoped never to need. This redundancy, this preparation for the unexpected, was as important as any single piece of equipment. Modern aviation has inherited this philosophy. Pilots and navigators are still trained in manual navigation techniques. Backup systems are required by regulation. The lesson of countless accidents and near disasters, going back to the earliest days of flight, is that technology is a tool, not a replacement for human competence. Edward Jameson would likely appreciate this continuity. The specific instruments have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental challenge remains the same: to know where you are going, and how to get there safely. It is a challenge that has occupied human beings since the first sailors ventured out of sight of land. and it will continue to occupy us as we venture further into the air, into space, into futures that we cannot yet imagine. His compass calibration trick, improvised in desperation over the Arctic in February 1943, was one small contribution to this ancient and ongoing endeavor, but it was enough. It saved his squadron, it advanced the science of navigation, and it demonstrated once again the extraordinary things that ordinary human beings can accomplish when necessity demands it.